October 6, 1973. The volcanic plateau of the Golan Heights, overlooking the Jordan Valley and the Sea of Galilee. As the sun fell behind the ridgeline and darkness settled across the basalt hills, Syrian armored formations began moving westward under the assumption that night itself would be their ally. For decades, Soviet military doctrine had taught that darkness neutralized precision, flattened technological advantages, and returned combat to mass, momentum, and courage. In Moscow, in Cairo, and in Damascus, night fighting was understood as a domain where numbers mattered more than optics, and where Western armies, dependent on visibility and electronics, would be forced onto the same crude terms as everyone else. What unfolded on the Golan that night did not follow that script. The Yom Kippur War had begun only hours earlier. Syrian forces, equipped and trained according to Soviet armored doctrine, advanced with numerical superiority that was overwhelming on paper. Hundreds of T-55 and T-62 tanks moved forward behind artillery barrages, expecting to exploit Israeli exhaustion from the opening daylight battles. Soviet doctrine emphasized rapid penetration, continuous pressure, and night maneuver to deny the defender time to reconstitute fire control and command cohesion. Israeli units, outnumbered and stretched thin, were expected to fall back, regroup at dawn, or collapse entirely. Instead, Syrian crews began encountering accurate, lethal fire emerging from the darkness itself. At ranges where Soviet manuals assumed engagement would be chaotic and indecisive, Israeli tanks were hitting first, hitting precisely, and disengaging before return fire could be effectively coordinated. Syrian commanders reported flashes on the horizon, followed almost immediately by penetrations through frontal armor. Vehicles were disabled before their gunners could even identify targets. This was not the grinding attrition battle anticipated by Soviet planners. It was controlled, methodical destruction conducted under conditions where Soviet doctrine predicted parity at best. The disconnect was not bravery, morale, or even training in the narrow sense. It was technological philosophy. Soviet armored doctrine in the late 1960s and early 1970s prioritized simplicity, mass production, and daytime combat supported by artillery and air defense umbrellas. Night fighting was treated as an extension of momentum, not a precision domain. Passive night optics, limited illumination rounds, and doctrinal assumptions about engagement ranges defined how crews were trained to operate after sunset. Israeli armored units, by contrast, had spent the previous decade integrating Western fire control concepts, many originating in the United States, into a doctrine built around rapid target acquisition, crew initiative, and first-round lethality. Their tanks were not merely platforms for guns. They were systems designed to see, calculate, and kill faster than their opponents under conditions Soviet theory considered equalizing. As Syrian losses mounted in the dark, it became clear that something fundamental had gone wrong. Not in tactics on the ground, but in the assumptions written years earlier in Soviet training manuals. The night, which was supposed to erase advantages, was amplifying them. The roots of that failure stretched far beyond the Golan Heights and deep into the intellectual core of Soviet armored theory. From the aftermath of the Second World War onward, Soviet planners studied tank combat through the lens of industrial warfare. Victory was achieved not through incremental technical advantage, but through overwhelming force applied continuously across the depth of the battlefield. Night operations were viewed as a means to preserve tempo, confuse the defender, and prevent orderly withdrawal, not as an arena for fine-grained gunnery duels. This philosophy shaped both equipment and training. Soviet tanks of the period emphasized ruggedness, low silhouettes, and ease of mass production. Fire control systems were functional but intentionally simple. Range estimation relied heavily on crew experience and visual cues, while ballistic computation was largely manual. Night fighting capability existed, but it was limited. Active infrared searchlights and basic image converters allowed crews to see at short distances. But these systems were easily detected, offered narrow fields of view, and degraded situational awareness. Doctrine assumed that at night, engagement ranges would collapse and precision would matter less than volume of fire and forward momentum. Israeli armored doctrine evolved along a different path. Shaped by limited manpower and the necessity of rapid decision-making, it placed disproportionate value on first-shot accuracy and crew autonomy. Beginning in the 1960s, Israeli forces absorbed Western fire control concepts through both domestic development and foreign cooperation, particularly with the United States. Improved optics, stabilized gun systems, better range-finding techniques, and rigorous gunnery training transformed Israeli tanks into platforms optimized for rapid target engagement rather than massed advance. Crucially, Israeli crews trained extensively for night combat as a deliberate specialization. Night was not treated as a degraded version of daytime battle, but as a distinct environment requiring its own procedures. Tank commanders were taught to fight semi-independently, exploit terrain familiarity, and coordinate fires through disciplined radio communication rather than visual signals. Engagements were planned around controlled fields of fire, pre-registered kill zones, and rapid displacement after firing. On the Golan Heights, these differences collided with brutal clarity. Syrian armored units advanced in accordance with Soviet principles, pushing forward in columns and waves designed to overwhelm by presence. But those formations became predictable patterns in the darkness. Israeli gunners, positioned on reverse slopes and prepared hull-down positions, used elevation, known distances, and disciplined fire control to engage targets at ranges Soviet doctrine had dismissed as improbable at night. The result was not a sudden collapse, but a steady unraveling. As Syrian commanders attempted to adjust, the very tools they relied on, mass, momentum, and darkness, worked against them. Each destroyed tank further disrupted formation cohesion, slowed the advance, and magnified the effectiveness of Israeli night gunnery. The engagement was no longer about who had more tanks, but who could see, decide, and fire first. The technological gap that emerged on the Golan was not defined by a single device, but by how entire systems were integrated and used under stress. Israeli tanks fielded during the war, principally upgraded Centurions and Pattons, were equipped with optical sights and fire control practices that emphasized rapid range estimation and stable firing platforms. While laser rangefinders were not yet standard across Israeli units in 1973, crews had drilled relentlessly in optical ranging techniques, using reticles, known target dimensions, and terrain familiarity to calculate distance quickly, even in low light. Stabilization played a decisive role. Israeli gunners were trained to fire accurately after brief halts or during slow movement, reducing the time exposed to return fire. Soviet doctrine, by contrast, accepted that accurate gunnery generally required longer halts and clearer visual confirmation. At night, that difference translated into seconds that often determined whether a tank survived its first engagement. Communication further widened the divide. Israeli armored units relied on disciplined radio networks that allowed rapid dissemination of contact reports, target-bearing updates, and fire coordination. Syrian formations, operating within a more centralized command structure, struggled to maintain situational awareness once initial contact disrupted planned advances. In darkness, the loss of visual cues compounded delays in command transmission, leading to fragmented attacks rather than coherent pressure. Perhaps most critically, Israeli defenders exploited the terrain with an understanding that night magnified preparation. The Golan Heights favored defenders who knew the ground intimately. Israeli units used pre-registered firing lines and reference points established long before the war. These were not improvisations made under fire, but rehearsed solutions to anticipated scenarios. When Syrian tanks crossed certain contours or skylined themselves on ridges, they entered spaces already mapped into Israeli gunnery plans. For Syrian crews trained under Soviet doctrine, the experience was profoundly disorienting. The expectation had been that darkness would compress the battlefield, shorten ranges, and obscure defenders. Instead, it revealed the rigidity of assumptions baked into their training. Tanks advanced into engagements where return fire came from unseen positions, often before target identification was complete. Attempts to use infrared illumination frequently backfired, drawing attention to firing positions rather than concealing them. As the night battles continued, the engagement ceased to be about numerical superiority and became a test of adaptability. Soviet doctrine had predicted that mass and night would blunt Western precision. On the Golan Heights, the opposite occurred. Precision turned the night into a force multiplier, exposing the limits of a theory that had not fully accounted for how technology, training, and doctrine could converge to reshape the battlefield after sunset. As the night of October 6th bled into the early hours of October 7th, the consequences of those doctrinal miscalculations became increasingly severe. Syrian armored units attempted to adapt in real time, shifting axes of advance, increasing artillery support, and pressing forward in renewed waves. Yet each adjustment operated within the same conceptual framework that had already been undermined. Soviet doctrine offered few tools for decentralized night fighting once momentum was broken. Commanders were trained to restore pressure through mass, not precision. Israeli armored crews, meanwhile, were operating at the outer edge of endurance. Ammunition stocks dwindled, crews fought with little rest, and losses mounted. But their doctrine was built to function under exactly those conditions. Tank commanders were authorized to make independent decisions, repositioning without waiting for higher approval. This autonomy, combined with intimate terrain knowledge, allowed Israeli units to reconstitute defensive lines repeatedly, often with fewer tanks but greater effectiveness. The contrast was stark. Syrian formations depended on synchronization across large units, a method well-suited to daylight offensives but fragile in darkness. When coordination faltered, gaps opened. Israeli gunners exploited those gaps with disciplined fire rather than reckless counterattack. Each successful engagement reinforced a pattern. Identify, engage, displace, and re-engage from a new position before return fire could converge. Air support, another pillar of Soviet-influenced doctrine, offered limited relief. Syrian forces had planned for close coordination between armor and air defense to blunt Israeli air power. At night, however, these systems struggled with identification and control. Israeli air operations were limited in the early phases of the war, but the defensive ground battle did not require air dominance to succeed. The armored fight was being decided at the crew level, in seconds-long engagements shaped by training rather than by broad operational plans. By dawn, the battlefield told a story Soviet manuals had not anticipated. Wrecked Syrian tanks littered engagement zones that should, by doctrinal logic, have favored the attacker. Losses were not evenly distributed across daylight and night. They clustered heavily in periods when darkness was supposed to protect advancing forces. The assumption that night erased qualitative differences had collapsed under empirical reality. This outcome did not imply that Soviet equipment was inherently ineffective or that Syrian crews lacked courage. It revealed a deeper issue: doctrine that underestimated the pace at which technology and training could alter fundamental battlefield conditions. The night was no longer a universal equalizer. In the hands of forces prepared to exploit it, darkness had become a selective amplifier of advantage. The implications of the Golan night battles extended far beyond the immediate outcome of the Yom Kippur War. Within months, after-action reports began circulating quietly through Soviet military institutions, stripped of rhetoric and focused on anomalies. The data was uncomfortable. Engagement ranges at night had been longer than predicted. First-round hit probabilities favored the defender rather than the attacker. Most troubling of all, numerical superiority had failed to compensate for inferior situational awareness. For Soviet analysts, this created a doctrinal dilemma. Their theory of armored warfare rested on the idea that technology could enhance mass, but not replace it. Precision was useful, but not decisive. The Golan suggested that this balance had shifted. Western-influenced fire control philosophy, when paired with intensive training, allowed smaller forces to impose order on chaos, even under conditions previously thought to negate such advantages. This realization did not immediately rewrite Soviet doctrine, but it triggered a reassessment. Greater emphasis was placed on improving night fighting capability, including passive night vision devices, better optics, and eventually laser rangefinders. Training syllabi began to acknowledge that night combat could no longer be treated as a degraded extension of daytime operations. Yet these changes would take years to materialize fully, and even longer to permeate Allied forces dependent on Soviet equipment and instruction. For Israel, the lesson cut in the opposite direction. The battles confirmed that investment in crew proficiency, decentralized command, and system-level integration paid dividends disproportionate to numbers. The experience accelerated Israeli efforts to further modernize armored fire control, leading directly into post-war upgrades that embraced thermal imaging and advanced rangefinding once those technologies matured. More broadly, the Golan Heights became an early case study in a trend that would define late Cold War combat: the growing dominance of information, sensing, and decision speed over sheer mass. What had failed was not a tank or even a weapon system, but an assumption that darkness was a constant, immutable condition rather than a variable shaped by preparation. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Western and Soviet planners alike increasingly recognized that night had become contested space. The Golan had shown that the side able to see, communicate, and act faster could bend even deeply entrenched doctrine to the breaking point. That realization would echo across future conflicts, from desert battlefields to Central European contingency planning. It began, quietly but decisively, on a basalt plateau where Soviet theory met an opponent trained to fight in the dark and lost. The long-term significance of what happened on the Golan Heights only became fully visible with time. In the years that followed, the battlefield patterns observed in 1973 began to reappear elsewhere, reinforcing the same conclusion. Night was no longer a neutralizer. It had become a competitive domain, one shaped by sensors, training, and doctrine rather than by darkness alone. The assumptions embedded in mid-Cold War Soviet armored theory were increasingly misaligned with the realities of modern combat. What failed on the Golan was the belief that technological parity would reassert itself once the sun went down. Soviet doctrine assumed that reduced visibility compressed engagements, simplified command problems, and restored the advantage of mass. Israeli night gunnery demonstrated that the opposite could occur. When one side trained explicitly for low-light decision-making and integrated fire control, communications, and terrain knowledge into a coherent system, darkness amplified asymmetry instead of erasing it. This lesson echoed into later Cold War planning. Western armies, particularly those operating with United States equipment or doctrine, accelerated investment in night fighting capabilities. Thermal imaging, stabilized sights, laser rangefinders, and networked command systems became priorities not because they were novel, but because they directly addressed the doctrinal failure exposed in 1973. The emphasis shifted decisively toward first detection, first decision, and first shot advantage, regardless of lighting conditions. For Soviet-aligned forces, adaptation was uneven. While later generations of armored vehicles incorporated improved optics and night systems, doctrine lagged behind technology. Training cultures proved harder to change than hardware. The Golan Heights had shown that equipment alone could not compensate for doctrinal rigidity, especially when confronted by opponents trained to exploit complexity rather than avoid it. In retrospect, the night battles of the Yom Kippur War stand as an early warning. They foreshadowed the broader transformation of warfare that would define the final decades of the Cold War and beyond, where sensing, integration, and human decision speed outweighed numerical advantage. What Soviet doctrine predicted on the Golan failed not because it misunderstood night as a condition, but because it underestimated night as a contested system. If this analysis helped clarify how doctrine, technology, and training collided on the Golan Heights, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. These stories matter because they reveal how wars are often decided long before the first shot is fired, written into assumptions, tested under fire, and remembered only if we choose to study them.